Okay.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to the Wednesday night RATPAC Radio Amateur Training, Planning, and Activities Committee here that Dan has asked me to join you with tonight. I've done a few presentations to this group, and I'm honored to have been asked to do this particular one, as this is something near and dear to my heart. I am Mike Ritz, W7VO, live up here in Scappoose, Oregon, about 25 miles northwest of Portland. And I am the ARRL Northwestern Division Director. And as you'll see later, rather importantly, I'm also the chair of the ARRL Program and Services Committee that this initiative was run through, very convenient. And I'm also currently vice president of the ARRL Foundation, which is the ARRL's scholarship and grant arm. So they keep me very busy there. So let's go ahead and get on and learn about the ARRL a Clean Signal Initiative. And why can't I advance slides here? Hold on. I got to click on something. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what we're going to do is give you a little bit of a brief history about the Clean Signal Initiative. And really, in a nutshell, it was a problem in search of an answer. And how the answer came up with was really kind of an interesting story. I was operating the ARRL DXCW contest in 2020 and having a good old time. And I had a heck of a time with a station down in Arizona that had key clicks that were so bad. And I was trying to work a new multiplier on in the contest, and I could not get near where that multiplier was because this station down in Arizona on 40 meters had a signal that was probably 5 kilohertz wide on CW. Just all kinds of key clicks, and I couldn't get anywhere near them. So I really wasn't very happy with that. Eventually, I think I ended up working the guy later, but and then I noted that afterwards, I'm on several contesting reflectors. I'm primarily a contester, as you can see by the station there. And there were other reports of people with really bad signals, really wideband key clicks on there, both from Europe and domestic stations. And so a lot of people were complaining on social media just how bad some of the signals were. And so I thought about this for a while when it was all over. It's like, hey, I'm the chair of the Program and Services Committee for the ARRL. We can fix the rules and maybe put some kind of extra rules in place. So I started looking at the ARRL DX contest rules, and there is a rule in there. It's called it's prohibition number 6. Under prohibited conduct, it says transmitting signals with excessive bandwidth, i.e. spurious emissions or harmonics, is prohibited. It doesn't really say what happens if you do, but it is prohibited. So then I took a look at the CQ contest rules, and they talk about things called unsportsmanlike conduct. And under paragraph number 5, signals with excessive bandwidth, e.g. splatter, clicks, etc., or harmonics and other bands are considered to be unsportsmanlike conduct, not prohibited, but unsportsmanlike. As a matter of fact, the CQ went a step farther, saying that entrants are expected to follow the rules and best amateur radio practices. Violation of the rules of the contest or unsportsmanlike may lead to disciplinary action by the committee. And disciplinary action in this case could be disqualification. And the ARRL doesn't quite go that far. And oh, by the way, CQ has the power. They're the contest people, right? And they actually have people that are out there monitoring the bands for enforcement. So if you've got a bad signal in a CQ contest, you can get caught and get disqualified for it if it's bad enough, especially if it's malicious in how it's done. So they have a little more teeth into it than the ARRL does. So the bottom line is, do we need to? I thought about it. Well, do we really need to tighten up the ARRL contest rules? To maybe put some enforcement teeth in the rules. So I put a note out on the contest reflector saying, hey, what do you guys think with all these bad signals? Maybe we should put some kind of disqualification criteria in the contest rules. And the resounding answer from the contest community was no. Not only was it no, it's don't touch our contest rules. You're not a contester, not a real contester, as one guy told me. You're not a real contester. Don't mess with our contest rules. Contesters can take care of themselves. So I was kind of stuck with my tail between my legs. What am I going to do? sitting there going, oh, gee, I'm not a real contester. Here I'm trying to make things better. And the contesting guys, they don't want anybody mucking with their rules. So then this guy named Ward Silver, if you guys know Ward, N0AX, he's the one that's the editor for the ARRL handbook. He wrote the book on grounding and bonding. He's very prolific ham. He's one of the most, I think, literally one of the most famous hams in the world, and really kind of a visionary. And he sent me an email saying, hey, I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to make things better. They don't want to hear about it. But I think we need to think about this from a different angle. There's a different way we can do it and enter the Clean Signal Initiative. And he brought up this idea of something that he had in mind called the Clean Signal Initiative. And it was really kind of a thought in his mind. And after a few email exchanges back and forth, he said, well, that's something we can do. Let's talk about that. And so the question comes down as to why do we need to have the Clean Signal Initiative? Well, there are a lot of bad actor signals on HF, both in phone contests and in CW contests. I'm sure you can hear them on the air. You guys that operate FT8, you'll see big, wide signals that take up multiple of those little signals time slots if they're loud enough and wide enough. We need to figure out a way to clean that up. Some of that is intentional. A lot of guys will set their radios to have a very fast rise time on the CW signal that causes key clicks. They'll deliberately set the radio up to cause key clicks. And they do that as a way to, stretch their elbows out, and keep people away from their run frequencies. So that's considered to be intentional. Some non-intentional. A new ham gets on the air and has its mic gain turned up too loud, and splatters, or has the ALC turned up incorrectly, or runs compression too high. And so there's a situation where the guy just doesn't know what he's doing, or maybe has something misadjusted. So it's not all intentional, but there is some intentional, especially in contests, and there are some not intentional. And the decision between Ward and myself was that policing is not the answer. We need to go after the source of it, which is how the transmitters are designed. And if you can design a transmitter so that it can't be set to cause interference, that's all the better, and it helps everybody. So what we need to do is try to go after the source. Also, another reason why it's needed is the HF bands are going to get more crowded moving forward. Number one is we have ARRL has a petition before the FCC right now called RM 11828, which is the technician enhancement, which would give technicians some limited phone privileges on many of the HF bands, about a 100, or I think it's a 100 kilohertz slot of all the HF bands below 10 meters, with the exception of 20 meters, and also digital privileges so they can have a better pathway to get their general. There could be thousands of new hams on the air if the FCC ever gets off their bottom and gets that passed. All of them are going to be new to HF. And by the way, most of the new technicians coming into the hobby are not tech savvy. Many of us have been on the air for many, many years. We started off thrilled with technology. And a lot of the people that are getting their ham licenses now, it's not the technology for them. It's a prepper attitude or a preparing for emergency MCOM, not necessarily the technical side of it. So, the reason that a lot of us got our ham licenses, I've been licensed for almost 50 years now. It's 48 years, 49 years this year. A lot of us got in for the technical aspects of it, and then a lot of people today, that's not quite so much. So they don't know all the technical aspects of amateur radios. They should. And cycle 25 is coming alive, right? There's lots of activity now on 15 and especially on 10 meters. And there's been lots of activity on those bands now, and there wasn't. So the bands are getting to be a lot better. Manufacturers have made over the years quantum leaps in receiver technology, primarily with the use of this software-defined radios. You turn one of the modern HF radios on now, and you can turn the volume control all the way up, and you'll barely hear anything without an antenna connected. And try that with an old FT1000D or something. So they've really done a very good job software-wise to make receivers so that they don't They're more selective, they're more sensitive, they're more immune to intermodulation distortion products coming in the front end. But unfortunately, the transmitters haven't kept up with that. They've gone from nice clean vacuum tubes to LD MOS transistors that aren't quite as linear. And so what we're looking for here is maybe pushing technology forward. Think about having not only just SDR technology, software defined receiver, but maybe having software defined transmit technology. There are several manufacturers that are using what's called pre-distortion to try to keep the signal within a certain bandwidth. So by pushing technology, what would get done with this, there will be no excuse for having poor signals. And we're really trying to push the envelope of technology, not only on the receive side, where it already is, but on the transmit side as well. As I mentioned, VMOS amplifiers are not always designed for signal cleanliness, right? They're not nearly as RF clean as the tubes are. Matter of fact, Rob Sherwood in one of our discussions mentioned that the cleanest transmitter that he ever tested in his lab, believe it or not, was a Collins 32S1. Good old reliable Collins transmitter, had much better IMD and spurious outputs than any modern transceiver that he's ever tested. That just tells you how much technology has really gone the other direction as far as transmit cleanliness is concerned. And as I mentioned, new hams are not as technical in the past, so they're going to need more help in setting up their equipment to make sure that they're not putting out garbage on the air. Let's take a look. Well, so that you could think to yourself, well, the FCC is in charge of all that, right? What are you guys doing that the FCC is not doing? And amateur transmissions are covered under FCC Part 97, paragraph 307. Emission standards, and it says basically that for all transmitters installed after January 1, 2003, the mean power from a spurious emission has to be at least for a transmitter below 30 megahertz has to be at least 43 dB below the mean power of the fundamental emission. And is that good? Is that not good? Well, I'm going to give you guys something to think about here in a second. For a station running 1500 watts of power, which is maximum legal power, and with minus 43 dB of spurious emissions, that winds up being about 75 milliwatts. Add a 3-element Yagi with 8 dB of gain, and you're putting out basically about a half watt of noise. And there are a lot of amateurs all around the world that are working the world on half a watt. And so here you are putting out noise. So if we can try to keep the noise and the spurious outputs down below the FCC limit, it's going to be better for everybody. Rob Sherwood in one of our discussions indicated that he thinks that with today's low noise receive technology, receivers now are about 30 dB signal to noise ratio better than they were 20 years ago. And in his opinion, transmitters have gotten noisier. So all the technology's gone into the receive side and nothing on the transmit side. We're going to talk about why that is in a little bit. So here's just an example of what I'm talking about. Here's just a little spectrum analyzer, imitation graph, and you've got a 0 dB reference signal there that you're monitoring. You've got a transmit output that just for arbitrarily, I'm saying is 43 dB in that single spur. But just imagine that if you had, all the products from that, all the other noise products that are coming out of that radio, even though they're 43 dB, they all add up. And you could literally have a legal signal that looks like the one on the right, where it just puts out all this noise forever, and yet it's still perfectly legal. So I think we can do with amateur radio being self-policing. The FCC, indicates that we are self-policing. We need to do more on the amateur radio side beyond what the FCC does, and we can certainly do that. So what we did is after Ward and I got together, I brought this proposal to the Program and Services Committee as an action item. They approved it. We generated what's called a working group for transmitter cleanliness, a little subcommittee of the Program and Services Committee. It's really great being chairman of the committee because I get to bring it, and they have to do it because I'm the boss guy, right? So the initial people that put the program together were myself, as the ARRL board PSC chair, and also because I was the start of this, I made myself the committee chair. Kristen McIntyre, the Pacific Division director, is also another brilliant RF engineer, educated at MIT. Was also on the committee. Carl Lichelswab, K9LA, the Central Division Director, is also on our PSC committee. He's worked for design engineer for Motorola for many, many years. Another really smart RF guy. Of course, Ward Silver, N0AX, the kind of the inspiration for this. Rob Sherwood, I'm sure you guys have heard about the Sherwood test that they do on receivers. NC0B out of Colorado, and then of course Ed Hare. It was very important to get the ARRL lab on board because they're the ones that are going to be saddled with this when it was all over. So Ed Hare very enthusiastically decided that this was something that the league really needed to get behind, and was really the driving force at the league level and the staff level to drive it. And I really got to thank him for the effort that he put in to make this thing work. So the result of this committee, after about 6 months, was a 11-page white paper called "An Opportunity Presented." This is going to be that was presented to the ARRL board, the Clean Signal Initiative. I said it wound up being 11 pages when it was done in January, and presented at the January 2021 board meeting. This is just the first page of the 11. And at the very last paragraph of the abstract says, the proposed Clean Signal Initiative is a project to clearly define signal quality problems and present it to the amateur community, along with mechanisms to address and correct the problem. This presents a unique opportunity for ARRL, the National Association of Amateur Radio, to be the definitive technical leader in this regard. And that was really my goal here, was to get the ARRL into the technical standards business. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So once this went to the board approved it by 15-0 vote. I did a big presentation for them about this program. Very similar. A lot of the slides you're seeing are the same ones that they saw at the ARRL board meeting. At this point, once it was approved by the board, it was turned over to ARRL staff, which was Ed Hare, basically, who was the lab manager at the time. And he's the one that assembled this committee. I thought I could get off the committee after the board was done with it. Ed Hare said, no, you're the one that's been driving this. You really need to kind of stay in here and make sure that we're doing what the board intends. So I'm on the committee. I'm not the smartest guy on the committee by any stretch of the imagination. I can certainly guarantee that. Rob Sherwood, very important guy on here to have on the committee. Ken Long, who works with Rob on a lot of his testing, has a lab very similar to what Rob has up in Colorado. I think he's also in Colorado. George Spada, W1GKS, who is the new ARRL lab manager. He's kind of representing the ARRL lab staff on the committee. Ed Hare, who has retired, has decided to stay on as the Clean Signal Initiative chair, which I'm very happy about. He actually retired from his job at the ARRL lab, but he felt that the Clean Signal Initiative was so important, he wanted to stay on as a volunteer and help out with that. And then we've got 3 other engineers: Vladimir Rydikoff, KM6US down in California; Adam Farson, VA70J, who's up in BC. And we've also got representatives on the committee from just about all the major HF transceiver manufacturers. I'm not going to name them by name, but you guys know who make, who are the big players, both US and in Japan, that manufacture HF transceivers. I'll let you guess who those are. But we do have, by the way, representation on the committee from all the manufacturers, and I'm really happy to see that. And they are stakeholders in this, just like the ARRL is, and just like basically anybody that uses an HF transceiver is also a stakeholder. So what's the charter for the Clean Signal Initiative? Well, it's to establish a ARRL sponsor program that accomplishes the following. Number one, as I mentioned, is to get the ARRL in the technical standards business. After all, the IEEE does it, the UL does it, the Society of Manufacturing Engineers does it, Society of Automotive Engineers already do it. They have their own standards that they develop. ARRL is the National Association of Amateur Radio, and we really need to be involved in setting the standards for amateur radio. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be doing it, other than nobody's thought about it till now. The goals of the Clean Signal Initiative: to create an incorporated best practice standards and especially testing methodologies to ensure that what we're getting from manufacturers meets the specifications, and not only minimum FCC requirements, but actually setting a passing bar that's excellent, not just okay. In other words, we're not going to go to the manufacturer and say, okay, what's the lowest common denominator here, and we'll use that as specification. No, believe it or not, at least one of the manufacturers has come to us and said, we want you guys to set a high bar, because you know what? We want to push ourselves to meet it. And once again, I'm very glad to hear that. I think all of amateur radio would be very glad to hear that. But I mean, the manufacturers, for the most part, are really stepping up. So the idea is to set a very high bar, push the technology, right? Just to make the manufacturers work a little hard to get that brass ring. These standards can either be homegrown, in other words, just be ARRL standards. However, Ed Hare is on the standards committee for IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. And what we're gonna do is he's gonna attempt to get these pushed through as IEEE standards. Once they're IEEE standards, we can also make them ARRU standards and make them basically worldwide. But I think it's very important that they also brand these as ARRL technical standards. After all, that's where they're coming from. They're initiating with the ARRL. For example, here's an example of a standard of ATS 001 continuous wave CW waveform standard, which will be a template for what a CW signal should look like. Talking with Ed Hare, I think they're going to roll all these parameters into one specification. That's kind of where they're going right now, but we'll see where it goes. And then test new commercial transceivers and amplifiers against the standards. So once these standards are established, agreed upon by ARRL lab staff, by all of the volunteers that we have working on the standards, and also by the manufacturers themselves. We're going to draw the line in the sand, and we're going to be testing, the lab will be testing transceivers and amplifiers against these new standards. The goals: certified transmitters and amplifiers that pass the standards, and basically you have a little sticker the manufacturer can stick on the box saying CSI certified by the ARRL. Use it as a marketing tool. These standards may be by mode, CW performance, sideband performance, digital performance. Those standards, the parts of the standards are not exactly worked out yet, but there may be a situation where it's a transceiver is an excellent CW transmitter, but maybe not so good on CW, or on phone, so they get a CW certification and not a phone certification, or maybe a gold standard where it cannot be set to be out of limits. And that's another thing that we're currently under discussion. And we're really, like I say, the manufacturers in this whole process are stakeholders. We really want to ensure compliance of everybody. And in my opinion, as a guy who spent many years in marketing, in product marketing, market pressure will persist. If one manufacturer gets certified, another manufacturer doesn't get certified, the hope is that consumers, amateur radio consumers, will apply market pressure to the companies that are not certified to get certified. After all, everybody benefits, not just the ARRL. And market this program to amateurs, which we're doing right now. I'm here. The fact that I'm here, promoting the program is trying to convince you guys how important I think it is, and hopefully, get you guys to think that it might be an important program as well. There was also an article that I wrote in QST that you may have glossed through, starting on page 55 in the June issue of QST. If you haven't read that, I would please urge you to read it. Basically, it's the same thing you're seeing here with a little bit more detail, but to me, this is kind of my legacy for the board, and I'd really like to see it go somewhere. And here's a very important part too, is to work with manufacturers and social media, and have the create training material to teach hams how to set up their equipment and how to ensure the cleanest transmitted signals. And David Minster, the ARRL CEO, is on board with this and working with his content creators, and having people, especially when we talked about some of the entry-level radios like the IC 7300, how to properly set that radio up so that it puts out the cleanest possible signal. There's really not much material out there currently to do that. They'll have reviews and they'll turn it on and show you how it works, but they're not really going to tell you, how you set the ALC, how you set the compression, how do you set the CW waveform, and try to get that education part of this out there as well. Here's an example of one thing that we're certainly going to be doing. This is a ARRL lab review right out of QST magazine in June of 2021. And this was for the Yaesu FTDX10. They've got all their specifications and whatnot. You can see what they're doing currently is they're showing, and hopefully you guys can see my little cursor here, but they're basically giving you what their readings are, and kind of in a red to a green, and then just giving you a number. But that doesn't really tell you that they really pass anything. It's just kind of, here's what the numbers are, and yeah, green is good, and you get down to the red area, that's not so good, but that doesn't really tell you anything. So part of CSI is essentially setting benchmark, and the benchmarks means if it's above it, it's good, and if it's below it, it's not good. Very, very simple. And what we're doing right now is trying to come up with these benchmarks. What they're working on right now, which I'll go through a little bit, is they've actually got the intermodulation distortion, which are these two first bars on the graph. There's a template for those where it goes down for 6 dB per IMD order, odd IMD order, I should say. Transmit keen sidebands, there'll be a specification for that. That's part of the CW waveform. And then transmit phase noise is actually the composite phase noise. And one that's not here has to do with the CW waveform in CW mode, as far as the rise time and the fall time, which are very important to keep key clicks to a minimum. And it's kind of interesting, when I was first working on this, I actually found Clean Signal Initiative already in action. This was a sidebar written by Bob Allison, WB1 GCM, who shortly after, I think, retired from the lab. But here they were testing this FTDX10, and they noticed that that the software enabled the operator to get choices of 1 millisecond, 2, 4, and 6 milliseconds of rise time on the CW signal. And anything below about 6 milliseconds, you have a risk of having key clicks. And the fact that Yaesu had it so they could set it down to 1 millisecond indicated that some operator went in there and set it to 1 millisecond, you could pretty much be guaranteed of having key clicks and being out of FCC specification for having the narrowest signal that you can to provide communication. So they actually worked with the lab, with the manufacturer, and they came back and changed that software setting to take away the lowest 1 and 2 milliseconds setting, and left added an 8 millisecond setting and a 6 millisecond. Turned out 6 milliseconds is kind of the sweet spot, but they added a 6 and they added an 8 to the 6 and got rid of the 2 fastest ones. So here's a situation where the lab found a problem. This would have not have passed the test of CSI. They went back to the manufacturer. The manufacturer corrected it, and so here's kind of a Clean Signal Initiative in operation before it was actually done. Follow-on CSI functions. Once again, a very important part of this is making sure that the ARRL Education Department works with manufacturers. They've got a cadre of social media experts. Dave Kassler is one of those. And other means to educate hams on how to use their radios. There's really not a lot of videos out there showing people how to physically use their radios. There'll be radio tests and people tuning around, doing stuff, but not really going into details. And long term, and one thing to keep in mind is similar to what the CQ does in their contest, is set up an ARRL contest, volunteer contest monitor program, where volunteers will basically listen what goes on in the ARRL contest, evaluate signals using SDR technology, and report if necessary. This is something that the CQ folks are already doing. The ARRL does not do this. I could see this being part of the CSI program, or maybe as part of the volunteer monitor program in the future, but specifically aimed towards making contests as clean as possible. So what's in it for the ARRL in this case? Well, for me, it's very important that the ARRL, as the National Organization of Amateur Radio, be seen as the premier technical standards organization for amateur radio. The FCC is not going to do it. We don't want the manufacturers to do it. We want the ARRL to be the driver here. This whole program is essentially the member benefit, right? We're doing this for the good of the members. And in fact, it not only helps ARRL members, but also non-members alike. This is something that's really good for anybody that's involved in HF operation in amateur radio. And oh, by the way, this can also be extended to VHF radios and UHF radios as well. Right now, we're focusing on HF radios, but obviously you can go on and also do it with other radios, amplifiers, anything that puts out a signal. The good news for the ARRL is this is really an extension of what the ARRL lab does already. So the additional cost of this program are pretty minimal. Everybody on the committee, with the exception of George Spada, is a volunteer. All of our meetings are done via Zoom. So there may have to be a piece of test equipment that the lab has to buy or rent to be able to make real precise composite phase noise measurements. But that was included as part of the budget for the program. So but the overall cost of the program are really pretty minimal. And then also, this is something that's very important on my time on the board. As I mentioned, I'm an ARRL director. And one of the things I mentioned when I presented this program to the league is the board spends an awful lot of time looking at itself, right? They have motions to change standing orders, motions to change what the board does or how it acts. And this is really something that the board can do that looks outward towards the member and give the member something that they can put their teeth into. And to me, this is a very important aspect of what the board needs to be doing, which is looking not at itself as it does very often, not to be critical of the board, but I think even Rick Roderick even mentioned to me that he heard me say this and just I guess he really liked it. So I'm very happy to have had that thought, but just basically give the board something to do other than just looking at itself all the time. Well, I can't read what this says because it's blocked off here. Oh, what role does the ARRL board take in this? This is being driven from the board to the staff, and my intention was not to have this. Oh, hold on, I got to click back in here again. My goal is not to have this be under control of the Program and Services Committee or the ARRL board. The board's job was to get it funded through the motion that I wrote up on the ground and running. As a matter of fact, I really didn't even want to be on the committee. I was asked to be on the committee to help drive it and to help make sure that they stay on track of what they're trying to do and be able to report back to the board. But this is not being controlled by the board. This is being driven 100% by the ARRL staff and the other technical volunteers that they've got working this. I'm just a guy looking, watching in awe of these guys do this. Falls under the AF, and eventually there'll actually be a technical standards committee put together. Right now, it's the Clean Signal Initiative Committee. Eventually, there'll actually be a technical standards committee as they get on to do not only this CSI standard, but other standards that we're going to talk about here in a second. And I did request as part of the motion that we have status updates to make sure this didn't fall into a crack somewhere. And it took about 6 months or 8 months for the staff to get the horsepower on board. They had to replace Bob Allison, who left, who was George Spada, who is there now. And like I said, even though Ed Hare has left, he has stayed on. So we've got 2 members of the staff that are heavily involved in this to make sure that it's successful. What are the risks of this? Well, we kind of thought this was one of the things I had to present to the board was what are the risks of this program to the ARRL? And one of them was that we'd have pushback from manufacturers, especially the big 3, the big 3 from Japan. That really has not been the case. I think they're on board. It helps them. It helps everybody with amateur radio, and they've the U.S. manufacturers I think have been stellar. Japanese manufacturers are right there with them. So I'm really proud about the fact that the manufacturers are stepping up as well. And we have really made sure that they are upfront and part of the solution here and as a key stakeholder, right? The 3 stakeholders here are amateurs, radio amateurs, the ARRL, and the manufacturers. We all have to work in unison to make this a reality. This is something that Ward Silver brought up when I first had my discussion with them, and that clean signals may be a hard sell to amateurs because you don't buy a transmitter because it's got a clean signal. After all, the guy sending the bad signal doesn't suffer the consequences. It's the receiver guy and the receiver on the other end that has to listen to it. You know, the guys down in Arizona that were sending key clicks in the ARRL DX contest, they didn't care they were sending key clicks. They were still making, people were still calling them. They were still getting contest points. But I on the other end had to put up with it. So, that's one of the reasons that I'm here to the RATPAC here is to try to make sure we can sell this program to amateurs. And I would encourage everybody to support it, tell your friends about it, and let's make this thing successful. If the certification of this becomes properly marketed by the ARRL, and I've talked to Bob Inderbitz, as a matter of fact, at Dayton, you people that may have been at Dayton, the lab actually had a big cardboard plaque thing that was hanging up in the placard hanging up in the lab booth, and we're handing out CSI badges, and they had all of us that were on the committee where these, asking about CSI. So they're already doing a pretty good job of marketing this. They allowed me to write an article for QST that ended up being a 3-page article, prominently right in the middle of QST. So I want to thank them for that. So the more the ARRL can push this, I think the easier it's going to be for amateurs to understand the importance of it. So now what, right? We got this thing rolling. What's the next step, right? The committees I mentioned, we have a committee that's meeting the first Thursday of every month via Zoom. The meetings usually last an hour to an hour and a half long, and they've been discussing basically a parameter a week. Rob Sherwood and Ken go off and look at their computer, analyze what they've done in the past, what manufacturer specifications have been in the past, and then come back and then they argue with the Ed Hare, and it's really rather interesting to see the dynamics that occur between all these engineers that are coming up with these specifications. So, like say for me, I'm an engineer, but it's interesting to watch these guys who are experts in this particular part of technology. Rob Sherwood is probably the industry leader in this and has been for many, many years. This is his passion in electronics, and it certainly shows. So what they're doing right now is working on HF transceiver standards. They're coming up with an intermodulation distortion template, which is going to be a mask for all the odd order IMD products. Spurious emissions, including harmonics, that's the one they're working on right now. A CW waveform template that makes sure that manufacturers don't provide a rise time or fall time that are too fast or too slow on the decay. To keep the signal nice and clean and keep that, the less of a square wave a signal is, the less chance there's going to be of key clicks, because everybody knows that square wave has infinite harmonics, right? That's where key clicks come from. So a CW waveform template, and then also this composite phase noise, which is AM noise, and I forget what the other one is, but it's basically the phase noise that's caused by the phase lock loop in the oscillator that's used in the VFO. That's where a lot of the phase noise comes from. If you guys ever turned an FT1000 on and turned the volume up, get a lot of phase noise in that thing. And a lot of transmitted phase noise on those older, very early ICOM, Yaesu synthesized radios. So they're trying to keep the phase noise down. They're trying to come up with a template for that as well. These standards I mentioned the goal is to put these into an IEEE standard template. It's also part of this whole thing is also coming up with standardized testing procedures on how they're going to test for these parameters to make sure that manufacturers and the ARRL are on exactly the same page and testing these things in exactly the same way. That's very important. And then when it's all done, let the testing and certification begin. I'm not sure where Ed has as far as their target date to have this complete. It may not be complete for a while yet, but that eventually it'll be done and they're able to get it going. It's been going on since this first came out in 2021. It's been 2 years in the making, and the ball is certainly rolling. And then the other thing to keep in mind is this Clean Signal Initiative may also move to receive standards. David Fadal, our FCC counsel, recently put a note out to the ODV, to the board of directors, indicating that the FCC is looking at setting receive standards. They've kind of given up on what they can do to enforce the spurious emissions that are coming out of consumer equipment, coming especially out of the Far East. So they're thinking about setting receiver standards such that to minimize or mitigate the problems they're having with the spurious unintentional radiators, like LED lights and grow lights and everything that are causing amateurs havoc. But if they can tighten up receive standards, they're not in that business yet, but the ARRL, has already sent a note to the FCC saying, hey, we can do that. You guys don't need to set standards. Let amateur radio set their own standards. That would be set through the ARRL, hopefully. So that's another thing that they can do. Here's just an example of a couple of charts. These were some things that the lab provided. They're in the article that I referenced in QST, showing a nice clean signal here on the left of a two-tone, looking at third, fifth, and ninth order intermodulation distortion products. And here's a nice dirty one here on the other side, showing one that's definitely will not meet the standard. As I mentioned, you can read all about it in the June 2023 issue of QST, pages 55 to 57. Oops. I would urge you to read that if you haven't already. It's basically this article was based on the 11-page, basically a condensed 11-page white paper that was written to convince the board about the product about the initiative. So if you get a chance, read that. And with that, I'll open the floor to questions. That's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you guys for listening and being here this evening. And I will now open it up to, I'll stop sharing and open it up to questions. Dan, the floor is back to you.
Helps if I unmute myself. Okay, Barry, what are we doing in chat?
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. One from Tom from W3TDH. Are there likely to be any sort of add-on to prevent these spurious emissions, or will it be necessary to buy new transmitters and transceivers?
Well, the good news is it would be basically a new products, and they're not going to go back and force manufacturers to upgrade anything. The idea is to push technology going forward. But one thing to keep in mind are, for example, some of the radios that are software defined, like Flex, they have the ability to go in and change transmit parameters as well. And it's once again, it's to push technology, but we're not going to go back and make manufacturers change anything they've already got out there. This is basically pushing the technology going forward, but some will have the ability to change it on their own if they so choose. Once again, one thing to keep in mind is this is not mandatory for the manufacturers. They could tell us to go take a hike and go off and design and build stuff and sell it to amateurs. And the hope is that amateurs will get picky, being that this is market driven, and they're going to decide that they want to have clean signals and force the manufacturers into coming along. But there's absolutely nothing that's forcing the manufacturer to do anything. These are not regulations. These are going to be voluntary. If you want to be certified and be and have that certification sticker on your product, here's what you're going to have to do it. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so what is the requirement for an average ham to determine if their existing transmitters are in compliance?
Well, the ultimate goal to this thing, and that's one thing to keep in mind too, is there may be a special gold star that can be applied to a product that cannot be misadjusted by the operator. For example, I mentioned having this transmit software defined transmit, where the transmitter will monitor its own signal, and if it's out of specification, will go in and change the parameters such that you cannot overdrive the ALC, you cannot overdrive the compression, you cannot get set the CW waveform to have faster than would be the cleanest signal. So the idea is to have these things go back and kind of set themselves eventually. I mean, that's what manufacturers should be doing. And that would, I think, that would help take some of the issues away of people unintentionally setting their radios to have spurious signals, and also, make it easier for new people that are coming in that aren't as technical as us old guys that have been doing it for a lot of times, and keep them on the straight and narrow.
Okay. Is it possible to have monitoring stations that older equipment users can call and get a report for their CSI?
I didn't quite understand that. You're
Okay, I guess they used to have the OO program that used to send out, good checks and bad checks and stuff like that. Just looking for monitoring stations can listen to their signals and get a report on how clean their signals are.
Well, they have that now under the ARRL's volunteer monitor program. They've got guys out there with SDR radios that can do exactly that. And they will actually send people, if you've got a nice, good, clean signal and they happen to note it, they will actually send you a report that you've got a great signal. The bad ones are, are the other on the other side of the spectrum. We recently had a guy up here in Washington that got a volunteer monitor notice that on 80 meters he had a signal on phone that was 10 kilohertz wide. That's pretty excessive, even on 80 meters. So even on AM on 80 meters. So he ended up with a notice, and if he continued with that, he was going to wind up with an FCC notice. So I mean I hope that answers that question.
Okay. Different manufacturers offer different controls with different names. Will ARRL create training material that addresses the differences?
Well, I think that's key. And the key is to make sure that, for example, I can see the ARRL working with ICOM and coming out with a video about the 7300 that says, here's how you can set all the controls. You're right, especially on receive. I think, the ICOM uses passband tuning, and Kenwood and Yaesu call it IF shift, and they're really the same knob. Sometimes these are marketing terms. A manufacturer may want to set itself apart from other manufacturers by calling a knob something other than what it is. They have the ICOM's got their dual peak, that they use as a marketing tool, that has the IF shift where you can move it at two directions at once. And that would be certainly the way to do with the CSI as well. As I mentioned, the goal here is to encourage the manufacturers to make it so that the operators cannot set their equipment such that it would cause spurious emissions. I mean, that would be I think the ultimate goal. That'd be I think the best thing that they could do. But once again, there's nothing to drive them to do that. And hopefully it'll be you guys and the guys out there buying radios that'll be driving them to do that.
Mm-hmm. Here's a good one. How about a CSI program for switching power supplies?
Well, that's a good question. If the power supplies that are in the radio are part of the problem, then they've got to correct that. That comes down to the phase noise issue. I mean, you can have a power supply hash that winds up going out through the transmit port, if the power supply that's supplying the power to the radio is bad. However, we're going after the transceivers here, not the accessory equipment. There may be a situation where this winds up being brought over to maybe power supplies as well. How clean is the power supply that's supplying power to the radio? Some radios don't have the ability to filter that out properly. And so this could morph into being more. It's, just think of this program right now as being open-ended as to what the possibilities are. I mean, the other thing we haven't really talked about are amplifiers. And a lot of amplifiers are pretty clean. There are some that you can easily overdrive, and they're not so clean. So, I mean, that's another part of this phase would be working with the amplifier manufacturers to make sure their signals are clean. Amplifiers aren't nearly as much of a problem as transceivers are, as what I've heard from Rob Sherwood in his testing. I think Ed Harris pretty much agrees with that.
Okay. Will there be a fee for certification?
Will what?
Will there be a fee for certification?
No, not as far as I know. I don't see that happening. I mean, basically, you think about it, the labs really they're doing the same testing they're doing now. I mean, what they're doing is setting benchmarks, pass-fail benchmarks. So they're really not changing what they're doing. I don't see why they would be charging for that. They don't charge now. I can't see them charging for it. But once again, that's going to be an ARRL/ARRL lab decision.
Okay. There's 3 questions from Dawn in Washington. Will the manufacturers have to pass with their default values, or can they twiddle the values to pass?
No. Keep in mind when the ARRL, when the lab does their testing, they don't get a radio from a manufacturer. They go out and buy one, and they stick it on their lab. They don't want to get ringers in there that may be specially tuned to meet a specification, and then they go to the production radios and find out that they are built a little bit differently. So nothing that the lab will change in that respect, and the fact that they're going to be basically getting off the shelf radios. Nothing is supplied from the manufacturer.
Okay. Are there plans to have training sessions to step through the evaluation process so that everyone understands how the tests are run? That's a good idea for the education people.
Oh, certainly, absolutely. I would imagine that I would see them doing that. I don't run the education department at the league, so I don't know what they would do. As all I can do I would encourage them to do that. Yes.
Okay, and the last question, how much of these spurious transmissions can be caught using lower cost SDRs to look at the transmitted signal?
Well, if you look at especially key clicks, you've got you can see these. If you've got a really good SDR receiver that's sensitive and can get the resolution down enough to look at a signal, you can see some of this stuff. That's how the FCC can check your how much passband you're using on transmit. They have the ability to do that with good SDR. You're not going to be able to see this probably on an RTL dongle, a $25 one off of eBay. But they've got very sophisticated SDR radios that can really narrow down and look at very, very narrow bandwidths and tell just how wide a signal is.
Okay, and that's all the questions from the chat, Dan.
Yeah, I see that Tom W3TDH has his hand up.
Yes, go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, sir. The question that came to me is, I don't mean to overhype this, but I know of a certain quantity of hams that love to hang out on 80 that are openly scofflaws. They're using the drivers that came out of old AM radio stations and things like that. They're punching out 5,000 to 15,000 watts of AM radio. I guess that's a volunteer observer problem, but I don't know how you'd measure that. And I don't imagine it can be affected by this program, would it?
Well, it would, no, because they're using commercial stuff that's probably 30 years old. The guy up in Washington that they caught, and it came from a complaint from a ham up in Washington that I sent through Riley Hollinsworth, who's in charge of the volunteer monitor program. I'm up here in the Northwest too. And so one of my constituents sent me a note saying, hey, I got these 2 guys up here that are on 80 meters. They got really wide signals. They're loud. And they're using, and one of the guys' QRZ page showed basically a rack full of equipment that was commercial AM broadcast equipment they was using on amateur radio. And that's what these guys are using. And guess what? He ended up, got monitored. They measured his signal at 10 kilohertz wide. He got a notice. And guess what? He hasn't been on the air since. So there's a way through the volunteer monitor program. If you know of people that are violating that, and deliberately putting these signals, the FCC's got a requirement that you use the narrowest bandwidth necessary to make the contact. That's in the FCC rules, and if they're violating that, the volunteer monitor program can take care of that. They've got the volunteer monitor program through Riley Hollinsworth has a direct line into the FCC, and they can quote unquote fix the issue. Okay, any more questions? Jim Idelson, I see you down there. You got to have some question.
Dad's out there too. He always has a question.
So I guess the question for you guys is, what do you guys think of this program? Thumbs up, thumbs down. You think it's going to be useful? Well, what of the people here? You guys support this thing? Or am I throwing water against the wind?
There's a thumbs up reaction in your reaction tab.
I can see some people, just because they're anti-ARRL, opposing it, but I think it's a great thing.
Well, what's funny is guys that are on, if you've ever on my ARRL voice, I put a notice out about this on my ARRL voice, and some of the comments that I got ended up being related to, well, if the ARRL screwed all this up, they're probably going to screw this up too, you know, or this isn't any good because the logbook of the world doesn't work. You know, it's totally irrelevant. But you know, the reason that they asked me to stay on the committee was to make sure that this stays on target, and I'm committed to making sure that happens as long as I'm on the board and probably after I'm off the board. So that's all I can tell you. I mean, that there's a lot of stuff the ARRL doesn't get right. I'm trying to make sure there's something that the league can get right. And it's definitely right now has the right horsepower behind it, including the manufacturers.
What is Abraham Lincoln that said you can please some of the people some of the time, most of the people most of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time.
As an ARRL director, I will say that's absolutely true.
Yep. I think
Absolutely
it's a great program. It's a great program to attract members.
Yes.
Well, that person
Okay, are there
has-
any more questions or comments?
Dan, WL7, California. You don't, you're blind, but your mouth goes. Don't you have a question? Nothing from Dan. That's unusual. Okay, well, it's been a great presentation. I appreciate it. Sorry, I was almost late. But I did make it. Thank goodness.
Yeah, but you
Almost only counts in hand
the
grenades and
spray
comic
rubber
bombs and
left
like
on the
that.
mountain.
Yeah, if anybody has any comments, you guys know how to get a hold of me. You know, I'm right on page 15 of QST, the ARRL Northwestern Division Director. W7VO@ARRL.org would be a good way to get a hold of me if you've got questions or comments. I'd be glad to answer them. You know, this has been going on for a couple of years now, and as I mentioned, this is something that I can, when I leave the board, eventually, this is something that I can say that you know, that I did to advance amateur radio. And I think not all the directors can say that, but I want to make sure that, you know, that we can do that and do something good for amateur radio. So I want to thank you guys for the time here this evening. I hope this was of use to you, and think about it. And if you got any questions, just get in contact with me.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming.
I'll make a comment. Mike is my director and part of his staff of SEMs out there, and I've been very pleased with his leadership. He does a great job. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Dan. And I didn't pay him to say that.